Everybody comfortable? Not like too blinded? Okay.
We're about to start. Come on over. Everybody come on up. Okay, we have one last panel today, our Friday keynote. We'll have obviously more panels tomorrow, so come back tomorrow. I want to thank everybody for attending and coming out. This has been a lot of fun. Everybody's really positive, has worked with us. We had some sound issues. We're going to try to figure that out a little bit better tomorrow, and working with us on the bathrooms. And big thanks to the International Center of Photography. I'd love it if everybody gave a round of applause to them. For them to give us the space. They're not going to move in until the fall. I think this is kind of unprecedented that they let us do this. And obviously thanks to the Theorizing the Web Committee. You know them because they have the dirty knees. We've been working, so a big round of applause to the committee, please. And last, our awesome music panel, and I just want to introduce the moderator, that's Sasha Geffen. So she's an associate editor for Consequence of Sound and writes for lots of really great publications. She's one of my very, very favorite music and culture writers. So I'm going to hand it over to Sasha, and one last panel tonight. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here. Welcome to Music and the Web. I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. To my left, we have Gavin Mueller, who is a PhD candidate at George Mason University. And then Reggie Ubu is the Deputy Music Editor at BuzzFeed Music. To my right, we have Naomi Zeichner, who is the Editor-in-Chief at The Fader magazine. And then to my far right, we have Robin James, who is an Associate Professor of Philosophy at UNC Charlotte. So thank you all for being here. New York City is a pretty good place to be talking about music, just because there is so much history wrapped up in this geographical location. I was actually at a bar last night, and the song Once in a Lifetime by the Talking Heads came on over the stereo, and my friend turns to me and goes, "Is this LCD sound system?" And I bring this up not to make fun of my friend Dan, who is here tonight, but to point out just how music and its locations have been losing specificity as we gather more music in popular culture. I think since the advent of recorded music, we might have just seen the biggest shift in music culture with the dawn of the internet. In the early 20th century, records started becoming a thing that you could buy and make and produce. And now music is becoming uncoupled both from physical objects like records, CDs, and tapes, but also from geographical locations and spaces like music venues or record stores, or all these spaces that used to be highly specific are now becoming less and less so. So I'd like to start this off by speaking to each of our panelists about how their work informed this intersection of music culture and digital culture. And I'd like to start with Robin, because I know that your work looks in part at social media and how sound bites and data that becomes music is transferred through these new networks. So how have you seen new spaces like Twitter or Facebook, or more specifically, music tailored spaces? How have you seen those inform the way that people consume music and engage in music culture?
Sure, great, thanks. That's a great question. So my background is as a pop music scholar, and back in the early 80s when music videos became a thing, there was a big debate. Simon Frith and Andrew Goodwin wrote about this, about how pop music now included this multimedia practice. It's not just the sound of the records, but also the video, right? Like pop music is a multimedia thing. So I think The challenge now is to think about how social media is part of the multimediality of pop music. So there's various ways, and like there's so many ways that it's affecting how music, not just how it's heard and shared, but also how it's composed, right? And I think that's actually the interesting question, right? So how is the mediality of social media affecting how music is composed? So like one way we can think of this is, so antiphony or call and response has a long history in music, right? Like Paul Gilroy wrote about this in the Black Atlantic, right? So there's a long history of sort of participation and interaction in pop music practice, especially African-American pop music traditions, which are the basis of US and UK pop music. So how is the specific kind of interactions, unique to maybe Twitter or YouTube, right? How are those different forms of musical interaction than, say, antiphony? Or how are they drawing on these traditions in pop music of audience and artist interaction, but modulating them in new and different ways, right? So you see stuff like the Chainsmokers selfie video, right? Which incorporated fan pictures into the video, and the video changed every couple weeks or whatever, right? So songs are written specifically for the purpose of having interaction in them, right? And you can even think of something like Katy Perry's Roar as a song written for lip-dubs, right? Every high school or whatever is gonna have their little self-empowerment lip-dub video of it, right? So, and if you wanna have a lip-dub, you have to have a positive message, you have to have something that amateurs can sort of understand and embody, right? It's not gonna be a too spectacularly difficult song, right? There's not gonna be a lot of melisma, right? So I think there's a lot of ways that the economy of social media and the mediality of it, right, the kinds of interaction that it facilitates, affect how pop music is composed, because it's also a business decision, right? So now that there's no money selling objects, or at least that's what they say, right, there's money in interaction, right? So I think this is definitely one place that the industry is looking, right? How do we build money out of interaction? How does the music industry adopt the business model of Twitter and Facebook? So briefly, yeah, those are some of the ways.
For sure. I'm also glad that we have Naomi and Reggie on the panel here because I think those channels and those interactions also change the way that people talk about and cover music. So Naomi, if you could just go into how the Fader's editorial voice is adapted to increase connectivity and increase interaction with artists who are sort of branching out in new ways across social media.
Yeah. I don't know, is this, I guess, do I don't know if you guys can hear me otherwise. Basically, I've been thinking a little bit about just sort of how the Fader's voice has grown since it launched, right? So Fader is a magazine and a website that launched like in 1999. So sort of, I think of it kind of as a digital native publication. And it was sort of built around the idea of DJs and kind of mixing different genres together and sort of surfacing, kind of digging into crates of the internet a little bit. And Fader kind of did access journalism at a time when it was sort of a small magazine and couldn't get access to a lot of stuff. So kind of covered weird and emerging music that sort of blended lots of different things and kind of like, I think really began in a lot of ways as like a local newspaper for internet music and emerging music that was kind of happening and being distributed on the internet versus in small clubs or whatever. And so I think now, right, 15 years later, everybody covers emerging music. We're not the only ones doing this, and we're a bigger media company than we used to be. So I think, you know, and also artists have a really different relationship to media than they used to, right? Like I think conversations that happen on social media are maybe more important than the traditional album review. In a lot of ways, artists speak to traditional media outlets in a really different way and are more scarce and kind of, right, like... Can you put the mic up close? Sure. You know, I think, like, music views happens on Instagram more than it happens on blogs. Or like, the memes that go around about the Drake album the next day or what your favorite writer wants to say about it. So I think as a magazine and a website, the Fader's kind of trying to figure out its role and what its voice should be. I think that's kind of, and how we best tell the stories of musicians, whether they're emerging musicians or huge pop musicians, and how we can kind of serve as a traffic controller in some ways to kind of put these stories in context and all of these things that are going across the wires. So I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, for sure, it's great. I think virality is a really big part of how people understand music. I was just at South by Southwest, and more than any song I heard over the stereos in various locations, I actually heard people singing the one Drake song that goes running through the six with my woes. I heard that line just being sung organically by people maybe 20 times throughout the 5 days I was there. It just kept coming up and up, and it's interesting. I'd never seen like music become viral in almost this like folk sense, in the sense that it's something you pass on to people that are around you in the physical world, and it kind of catches on and moves through space when you put a lot of people who are into music in the same place together. So I think I'd like to move to Reggie, because you work for BuzzFeed, which is synonymous with virality in some corners of the web. How do you approach coverage, both from like a long form editorial standpoint and from like a kind of quicker, like memified standpoint?
Yeah, is this on? Can people hear me?
No.
Yeah.
Hello? Okay, it sounds a little better. Yeah, that's a great question. I think Drake is like certainly the perfect example when you talk about virality and sort of meme culture and how it's intersecting with music now. I think a huge part of his success, I wrote a cover story about him right after YOLO had happened, and he just has this ability to sort of tap into culture, to certain people of a certain age, and create these phrases that are not just song lyrics, right? They become a shorthand for the way that we live our lives. And I think in a lot of ways that sort of, that idea that a song can't just be a song, like it needs to be a meme, has been like a really dominant theme in a lot of the these songs that you'll see on the Hot 100 in the past couple of years, certainly. I think for BuzzFeed, it's interesting because it's very much a new entrant, certainly in music journalism, but also in journalism more generally. And along with that, it started as sort of a media lab where people were tracking things that were going viral on the internet, and the idea was you could come and sort of find these things that were really interesting and crazy and fun. And so I think in the beginning, the music coverage sort of followed along that line, whether it was something like Rebecca Black, where it's a totally internet viral phenomenon that's very much music centric. And then as we became more heavily invested in journalism and beefed up the reporting operation, we switched to doing both viral content, but also more long-form, deeply reported stories around music culture, around the music industry, and started to use some of that access, some of that, some of the size of our platform to start to create content with really big artists and sort of trying to create things that are original and feedback into the community. And doing that, we follow what we learned by seeing what goes viral and seeing what resonates with people, and trying to create non-traditional articles, taking non-traditional approaches to profiles, and find new ways to do music journalism in a way that's going to resonate with people today.
For sure. The labor of journalism has changed so much, but also the labor of fandom has also changed in a really powerful way, because now you take someone like Rebecca Black, the organic interest in that kind of musical object of her Friday video is so much more powerful than any kind of campaign that could be deliberately launched by an artist label or recording company. Gavin, as someone who's pursuing culture studies, how do you see the web changing the labor of participating in culture?
When I think about, I guess I think about it as larger than just the web, right? Because the web, I guess we tend to think about the way the web alters kind of music distribution, right? Like how we get music, how we access music, how we don't have to pay very much or anything to access it now in the way that we once did. And that's, of course, like super, fascinating, relevant. But another thing I think about too is other kinds of sort of digital technologies and how that impacts not just the distribution of music, but also its production, right? A lot of my research, past research, focused on DJs and DJ culture. And at the time, it was when Serato, the DJ software, was emerging, and it was sort of having a really sort of, it was greeted with hostility, but not just hostility. There was a lot of ambivalence as well around people who had come up who had learned how to DJ in a very different way, where there was a lot more sort of emphasis on kind of technical skill, but also where that skill was communicated through kind of community-based sort of education, where you would be sort of picked out by you'd be sort of made an apprentice, right, of an older DJ who would sort of show you the ropes and teach you. And Serato is seen as kind of threatening, and probably accurately, that kind of, those kinds of traditions, right? But there's also a lot of ambivalence, because also a lot of the DJs were really excited, not only that you could do more different things with these new kinds of technologies, but that also more people had sort of access to this than ever before. So there was a little bit of tension there between people who were worried about sort of people who didn't come from these sort of traditions, and I was specifically looking at the time at Detroit DJs who were also, this is not only a kind of local cultural practice, but also like an important economic engine of the city, is dance music. Being sort of concerned about having all these sort of increased competition, people that could draw on other forms of social capital to sort of launch sort of music careers, and didn't have to go through the kind of traditions that they did. But also the fact that, DJs are of course like the biggest music fans, right? So they're also very excited about new kinds of voices being heard, right? And I really think I think there's a lot of talk about like distribution and piracy and Spotify and these kinds of things, right? But to me, and then it's fascinating stuff, and to me the production side is also totally intertwined with that, and totally really important to the conversation, I think.
Yeah, the process of making music hasn't been completely democratized, but I think the idea that you can make an album on the same device that you use to call your parents is something that's incredibly new. Not everyone, has the capital to go through and learn how to program an iPhone to do certain things. It's not necessarily that, as soon as you get the device in your hand, you're on the same level as everyone who's ever made music, but the access and the ubiquitousness of the technology that used to be incredibly hard to pursue is something that I think has changed the way that people are able to approach making music as creators. And I think that the line between creator and fan has somewhat softened. I don't know, just because now you can have just music listeners, fans making mixes on SoundCloud and just uploading them and running with it and putting their own stamp on it. It's not necessarily the same as making a song from scratch, but it is a more participatory and open way of engaging with music culture. Have you seen that those kinds of events, of spaces, participatory spaces, have infringed on more traditional ways of engaging with music, like going out to DJ nights or going to clubs, like where electronic music essentially started?
That's a great question, because I'm reminded of piano reductions of operas to be played by women in their living rooms on pianos, right? So sort of the reprivatization of the big public spectacle. So rather than say, like, this is some new thing, I'd rather say we've been doing this for a long time. It's just reappearing in new formats, right? So instead of me going to see LCD Sound System at the club, I get, losing my edge off Napster, Grokster, or whatever, 2002, right? And, make my own sort of mix of it, right? Which seems a lot like I have the piano reduction of Du Meistersinger, right? And I'm going to play it by myself in my living room in my own way. It's just that before I had to invite people into my living room to hear that, but now it seems it's easier to be more public with that individual, private reimagining, I guess. Yeah.
I think one thing that's interesting about to me about DJ culture is it sort of always was a kind of this softening that I like that word, softening between sort of fan and artist, or between consumption and production, right? Because it's sort of creating a production out of this sort of process of consuming records, right? I would say that you don't have to talk to people who are working DJs for very long to hear them sort of complain about the rise of the amateur DJ or the rise of DJ iPod, because this is sort of like one thing that happens, right? Is with opening up sort of all these new opportunities, right? We're still sort of in a context where where DJing or sort of curating music in these ways is also a work. Is also work, right? It's also a livelihood, a form of employment, a form of labor, right? And so when it's Econ 101, right? You have an increased supply of these people who are willing to do it, and then the price of that labor falls, right? So there's a lot of tension there, right? Because you have, every single DJ you talk to will be like, they'll have that sort of the people that only play for free drinks, or so they can, flirt, for lack of a better word. I think that's also important. But I liked what Robin was saying about the sort of home piano playing, right? Because it points to the idea that playing music, right, isn't just a form of sort of productive labor. It's a form of work that you get paid money for, but has also historically been a kind of reproductive labor, right? I mean, the only way you could listen to music for a long time is you had to make your wife, or if you were the wife, you had to play it for your family, right? I'm sure there were a lot of people that were very creative, but I'm also sure there were a lot of people that really resented that too, right? But I think that's a great point, right? It's also in the realm of reproduction, right?
Yeah, the idea of music being mostly the domain of the domestic sphere for a while, and then permutating into something that you had to go out and buy, and you had the object. It wasn't something you made yourself anymore. It was something that was made, and you could still bring it into your home and reproduce it multiple times, like as many times as you wanted on record or then on CD. It's strange that I guess the role of just everyday music making, of musicianship as an everyday domestic activity has sort of waned now that it's so easy to hear music that has been made by people who do that. It's more of a designated economic role as opposed to just a form of domesticity.
And I think you even see this with fan labor, right? Like all these forms of traditional women's work that now, this is the economic model, right? Like we're going to formalize this and include it in the economy and then make it more prestigious when men do it.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And I think Taylor Swift even does this with her sort of reblogging, I sent my fan a gift basket, now I'm going to use this to help my brand image, right? Yeah.
Right, yeah, the potential of interacting with a celebrity amplifies the willingness to engage with a celebrity on sort of a one-to-one level, because you could be the next gift basket recipient. Do you think that, and this is for anyone who wants to chime in, that Twitter as a space, because with Taylor Swift, that's kind of where that happened. That's where she put out, direct responses to fans, just by retweeting the photos that she had taken of the gifts that she had sent them. Do you think that the access that we now have to celebrities, does that lessen the idea of the unaccessible celebrity? If you think back to the Beatles, who were maybe the first music celebrities in a big way, or Elvis, there was this idea that, you could not access these people. They made music, and the music was the only connection that you could have to them. Has celebrity become less valuable now that you don't have to listen to Taylor Swift's music? You can engage with her social media brand?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it makes her music less valuable, but I think it does. It makes it not the most important thing. I think I know more about the way Taylor Swift acts on social media than I know about music. I think that's kind of rare. But I don't know. I think that it's like Taylor Swift being on social media a lot doesn't necessarily make her more transparent and accessible in my understanding. I think it's sort of just says that it's a tool for sort of messaging and just like music is a tool for messaging. I think that she's absolutely a uniquely talented and savvy person at that. But if anything, I think that, you know, it's sort of like the way that she uses social media becomes a way that she can show her virtuosity in the same way that she writes a song. And I think that her and Drake are both great examples of people who sort of balanced scarcity of keeping people interested in wanting to know more and wanting to participate and know more with kind of a sense of generosity and creating a culture and creating something to be a part of. So I think that they're doing a good job.
Yeah. And when you talk about how celebrities in the past used to be sort of more distant and remote, I think that's changed these days because the audience would really let you can't get away with that. I mean, I think a lot of artists would love to disappear and only come up whenever they have an album out. Well, it doesn't really work that way. The economy doesn't work that way. I mean, I think for Beyonce, who was someone who has historically been criticized for being very cold and distant, I mean, there was a time when, you could say that maybe she was a celebrity like that who was very inaccessible. But then, she got on Instagram, and now you can see what she's doing every day. And so I think there's an understanding, and Taylor Swift is certainly a perfect example of this, that if you're going to be truly a superstar, then you have to give the people something. Like you need to be where they are. And everyone's on Instagram, and everyone's on Twitter, and that's where music is happening. So I think that there's not really an option to sort of avoid those platforms.
And I think the more you give, the less you'll be questioned, right? Like I think about how Beyonce used Instagram after the elevator incident,
right.
And I think that people were very just satiated by what she had to say. And she literally said that, there's no text in Instagram, so it was like this incredible text-to-language response, Like it was really beautiful.
In a way, it's almost like celebrities have become their own paparazzi, or at least destabilize the role of the paparazzi to the degree that they can post family photos with their own gaze. They are not necessarily under the gaze of the media.
I think that's certainly true, and I think celebrities who are really savvy about that do that deliberately. I mean, that happens exactly with Taylor Swift when she had been photographed on a yacht with Haim or something like that, and they were wearing their bikinis. And there's this whole mythology around Taylor Swift where her belly button had never appeared in public. But while they were on this boat, they could see the paparazzi on the shore taking photos of them, and they knew that those photos were probably going to appear on TMZ, by that night or the next day. So Taylor Swift specifically went to her Instagram and just posted the photos. And I think that's a really smart way to take the power away from the paparazzi, although the photos still got out there, so she didn't have that option of privacy, which you could say is unfortunate.
But being able to present the moment
in her own terms, yeah, certainly.
I think you see this a little bit with artists who leak albums on purpose too. The idea that the only way you could put out an album at the dawn of recorded music was to go through a label, to go through an industry that had the resources to actually make these objects. And now that anyone can just put MP3s on Dropbox and toss them out, you see artists responding both to fan pressure and label pressure and to leaks in ways that sort of smacks of generosity, but is also strategy in a really big way. You see Run the Jewels, a couple days before their album was supposed to come out, it leaked anyway, so they were like, okay, well, we're going to leak this too. We want this. We want to be in control of the way that our music is out there. We want people to know that they have our permission, that they're not breaking rules. And I think that there is sort of a code between fan and artist, that consuming an artist's output should be done, if not legally, then at least respectfully. I know people who have no real economic qualms about downloading music illegally, but who feel bad. They feel like they're violating some unspoken tenet of the covenant between them and the artist that they love. So I don't know, do you see artists sort of responding to that, or setting their own rules for what is appropriate almost on a social level when it comes to what information, what data they're willing to give up?
In terms of just how they distribute their music, yeah, I think artists are certainly more in control than they've ever been about how their music gets out there. I mean, certain leaks happen, but they have the tools to respond to them in a variety of ways. Same thing that happened to Madonna. It happened to Kendrick when his album came out. You know, if the album leaks, then they can put it up on Spotify. You know, that same day. Yeah, and I think part of that too is just the extension of the album cycle. The idea that people are constantly just going to be putting out music, regardless of whether or not there's an album. I mean, we already talked about Drake, but he's another perfect example of that. Charlie XCX is another example of that, where it's not really about, oh, I have an album out. It's about, you know, I'm on tour, so here's a new song. Or, you know, I'm going to make an appearance on the MTV Movie Awards, so here's a new song. And so I think the rules for distribution, there really are none at this point.
Thanks. I want to push back a little bit, because I wouldn't say that labels are not important. All these big pop stars are on labels, and those are hugely important for how everyone consumes. And as the conversation has pointed to, consumes not just their music, but their sort of celebrity, right? We're consuming Taylor Swift pop songs, but we're also consuming her belly button. That's kind of gross. But so, I mean, labels are still important, right? All these people are labels. There's definitely been a restructuring, right, of the music industry. And I think that there was a moment in time when it felt like a democratization, but I think it's also important to like sort of point to how, you know, there's still all these mediators, right, between music artists and between their fans. There's a lot of, I think it gets kind of caught up in a sort of general sort of techno-utopian rhetoric of what the internet has done. It's made everything open, it's made everything democratic, it's made everything accessible, but actually we have mediators. We still have labels for one, but we have all these other sort of venues that now are the sort of gatekeepers for how we consume music, right? Whether it's Twitter or whether it's Instagram, right? And it is really interesting to me as well that these mediators are not really based in sound at all, right? I mean, they're based on image, they're based on text, which is supremely interesting to me. But I mean, there's also, you know, I don't know, I think it's really uneven, right? I guess how the sort of the openness or the access comes, and I think, you know, you're pointing to the fact that even with these, there's a sort of an illusion, right? When Beyonce posts on Instagram that we have a sort of direct access to her, right? And it's even sort of in the way her photos are constructed, there's this kind of intimacy there, right? But that's also sort of illusory itself, right? Because this is also very sort of constructed and thought over and poured over, and you know, there might have been a marketing strategy meeting about these photos, right? It's not outside the realm of possibilities, right? So I always want to sort of, you know, bring that stuff up as well, right? Because I think it's very important.
There's a lot that's still opaque when it comes to how we consume any media. Really, we don't think of Twitter as being necessarily like a music tool or as an entity with any kind of agency of its own, but it is watching us and how we consume music. And there's still capital tied to music, although it seems to be concentrated, maybe not on fewer artists, but there are still artists that make money but it seems like only Taylor Swift is really making money, like capital M money. Her album last year outsold just about everybody, and even people who, like Drake or like Kendrick Lamar, who put their music up on Spotify, don't see the kind of consumption that defined music celebrity a few decades ago. So I don't know, do you see like music fans sort of taking these mediators into consideration when they're on Twitter kind of freaking out about Kendrick, or in any space of music socialization? Or is it just kind of this like veil that is there but we don't think about?
I don't know if I understand.
Oh, I might be out of
I don't know.
So I think like, what is like the cultural effect of having a mediator like Spotify or a mediator like Twitter, or even like the cable company that supplies your internet? Like if those are your primary channels through which you consume music, like do they disappear like in kind of the moment of celebrating it, or are they?
I think for plenty of fans they do, right? Like my little brother pays for concerts way more than I do, and he doesn't look at Twitter at all, you know, and like when he goes and sees Axwell and Ingrosso, he has a really good time. And I think actually there's tons of music fans that have that same experience, right? I think like, I don't know, there's a song right now, it was Khalifa's song, that's the #1 song in the country, and that song launched at radio. It was not a song that I see anybody talking about on the internet, and it's the biggest song in the country. Or Reggie wrote a great article about how movie soundtracks are selling like crazy. So yeah, I think there's a whole echelon of like really the biggest rung of music consumers are actually, I don't think thinking about these conversations, or not always thinking about these conversations. They're just trying to put something good on and Shazam it and like tell their mom or whatever. But yeah, I think that absolutely there's a lot of artists who are very, when they're making songs, concerned with these conversations, right? And I think just to keep talking about Drake, right? Like people are self-conscious of wanting to create songs that will kind of create conversation, create lingo, you know, be something that's kind of memeable and memorable. Yeah. So, and I think that's a cool pressure personally, because I think that's, you know, as a writer, right, who's maybe less of a music theory pro and more just interested in stories, I think those are the things that I can hang on to.
Can I just add on to that? You were talking about like artists' concern for what's memeable. Like earlier I was thinking, well, like musicians have always been interested in the hook or the earworm, right? And that's a sonic sort of little meme, right? Like even people talk about Mozart being concerned with it, like what are people gonna walk away humming? Right, and again, sonic music-based, but now it seems like there's largely text-based, right? Right, so like even Taylor Swift was going to copyright this sick beat, right, for me to use, right? So it seems like the hook has shifted in some way to the text-based meme, in a way, right? We don't want the little earworm because that's not as viralable, right?
It's not shareable in a material way.
It's not shareable on social media. But I think that's the important thing, right? Like, it's not the text-based meme, that's what becomes viral on these platforms, not the sonic thing. Yeah.
I guess though it's interesting, like on all these lip-dub sites and even on Twitter when people are like, in my little wavy voice, like people's ad-libs, like little sound bites actually still, I guess, do go viral and we say them to each other. And I think that's why I think in a text-based, photo-based, meme-driven economy, people who sound really crazy kind of stick out. You know, people who can do really crazy voices, like Nicki Minaj doing a crazy voice or whatever, can stick out in the same way that like a really crazy Rihanna photo can stick out.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a layer to just. You can reference an auditory hook with text. So it's not just that, you know,
There's a lot of overlap.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you see people doing the Lil Wayne voice on Twitter and, you know, making puns about one of his songs, or doing the Drake voice, or I saw, like, an hour-long conversation that was just, like, two people riffing on All Day by Kanye West and, like, making puns. So you do have these sort of referential points of text that link back into the sound itself. I guess, I don't know, we've been talking a lot about pop music and the sort of upper tier of music popularity. I want to talk a little bit about what used to be known as the underground, just because it now is so visible. And it seems to exist on the same plane as the latest Drake song, the latest Wayne song, Nicki Minaj. If you're on music Twitter, you scroll through a bunch of different labels and a bunch of just different people who work in music or who talk a lot about music on Twitter or who just really like it. And you'll see, you know, some SoundCloud DJ that has no name and no location attached to them being cited as like the best song of March alongside, you know, something that Kanye put out. And just the flattening of that plane is something that I'm really interested in, because there used to be more of a spatial barrier between, you know, going to a concert with a pop star and then, you know, seeing a concert in someone's basement. And concerts still do happen, that is still the case, but now when it comes to internet as an augmentation of radio, you don't see that barrier as much. Like the underground is open, it is porous, it can bubble up pretty much at any moment. Do you still see people kind of taking pride, I guess, or identifying with like scarcity when it or just, I don't know, anonymity, like smallness of an artist? Like if an artist is very new and they are still in what can be considered the underground, like does that still have cultural capital the way it once kind of did?
I think it's interesting, like a lot of the artists that are, you know, in the Fader we might cover like a rapper like I Am Sue and a rapper like, I don't know, like Drake side by side, and might consider their stories equally important and them a part of the same culture, and kind of think that our audience wants to know about both of them and that we're all talking about everybody on Twitter together. Right, but like I'm Sue cannot sell copies of his album, and Drake can, and I think actually a lot of the artists that the Fader covers feel very frustrated and confused by that. They're like, I have hella mentions. Why can't I get on the iTunes charts? You know, and I actually think that the gap between the underground and pop music or even middle tier music is enormous. And SoundCloud plays don't make you money. Like, I think to that extent, like if there's a badge in being underground, I think that the artists that I see kind of thriving, I think there's kind of two ways to thrive as an underground artist, and I think often these overlap, but I think either you have that glitter of street credit on you, and so Red Bull will cut you a check, or whatever, or Beats will throw you some money to kind of like be young and exciting and new, and I think that the hunger for that from brands comes a little bit from the pace of the internet and wanting to kind of unearth something new and something viral. So I think that's a good way to live, and that a lot of artists sustain themselves that way. Or you can really like scrap together a real community and tour, right? Like tour your cities that make, I don't know, and I think there's lots of bands who still do that. I think Run the Jewels actually is a great mid-level example. You know, they made money on Kickstarter. They make money from brands, and they make money on tour. You know, those guys have been on tour together for like 3 years solid. And so yeah, I think that absolutely there's kind of like there's still a badge in really creating community, and I find that artists, because music making is not as normal and like not every girl grows up to play piano anymore. I find that a lot of the musicians that I talk to have actually been, I've always been really surprised by this, that a lot of these sort of like, these producers who are supposed to be this sort of like, I taught myself Serato or whatever, actually have learned it from somewhere, right? Have been in a not-for-profit education program, or had an uncle who really helped them out or whatever, and then have thrived within a community, found a studio that really makes sense, or maybe maybe they go record at Converse's studio or whatever it is, you know, but I think that actually like people really are sustained by underground communities still. Absolutely.
I think part of it too is the underground, you know, it still exists in the sense that the underground is what you don't know about, right? And I think there's a lot that any given music fan doesn't know about, but it doesn't mean that it's not important or it's not significant. I think one of the interesting things that we see at BuzzFeed is that there are these huge, hugely passionate fan communities that a lot of people don't really think about. They're not getting covers in Rolling Stone, but they have, you know, 2.3 million followers on YouTube, but you never heard of them. So, I mean, you could consider that its own sort of tightly knit community, right? Even though it's freely available on the internet, anybody can see it. But I think that one of the consequences of the way the media has been fragmented is that, you know, people exist in their own little bubbles, and they go to their own sites, and they have their own curators, and they have their own points of reference and spheres of influence. And those things kind of can play the role of an underground community, even though, you know, it's more open, theoretically.
I think you're right. I think that there does have to be some kind of filter for the vast quantities of music information or any information that's available. Is theoretically there, just in the same way that all public space is theoretically available to somebody, but in IRL space, you're restricted by geography, and online, you're restricted by social connections, by who you trust online.
What your favorite blog is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Or who's on your timeline, like how you're modulating that. Do you see those augmenting physical connections or like physical communities, or are they almost subsuming them in a way?
I think maybe subsuming. I don't know. That's an interesting question. I think in a lot of ways, no. I think that people that are fans of the same artist, you know, one person could be in Korea, another person could be in Alabama, and that's just an everyday reality of the way music is distributed now. But at the same time, yeah, I don't know. I think there are still local, geographical communities, you know, whether it's here in Brooklyn, whether it's in Atlanta. And I think those things still exist, but I don't think that they're dependent on the internet. I think the two are kind of separate.
Yeah, one thing I uncovered when I was doing research in Detroit was the scene there was a sort of very strong local scene that was sort of fragmenting for a lot of reasons, but one reason was it was seen that there were more lucrative markets overseas. One thing I was interested about is I was researching music that was sort of produced by black DJs and sort of had a lot of like sort of highly racialized signifiers attached to it, but then became really popular in like Paris or Brussels. And so I was initially attracted to like, you know, what's going on here, right? Is this a kind of fetishization, right? And what actually ended up being more interesting to me was the sort of economic questions, right? Was that the DJs themselves had no problems that a bunch of you know, European teenagers wanted to dance to their music and hear them DJ, and sometimes they would get to fly overseas, and they'd never done that before, and it was very exciting, right? But at the same time, it sort of and they were all for that. At the same time, though, one thing I noticed is it's sort of all this sort of strong network of local institutions, and it wasn't just because of the internet. There were other reasons attached to it as well. But there's a sort of decline in other kind of forms of like local institutional media, right? So you had a sort of corporate takeover of radio stations, which is pretty well understood. One thing I discovered that's less well understood is that the club scenes, clubs were locally owned, and increasingly those were bought up by larger national and even international conglomerates. Dance clubs, but also strip clubs, which had been has for generations been a really important venue for music in Detroit. So as those got more sort of corporate, these artists sort of get pushed to look overseas. And I mean, it seemed, you know, I don't want to, of course there's still local scenes, but in that case it really did seem like, and it's not, again, I don't think it's something you can just blame the internet for, right? But there was a sort of decline, right? And I can't get away from thinking about that as somehow a little bit tragic, right? At the same time, now I live in DC, and the big sort of underground music there is go-go music, which is still, it's not what it once was, but is still hugely popular, and it's also really interesting because it was never on labels. You can't buy like a studio recording of go-go music is like a kind of funk band, and they never really, very rarely would go to sort of studio recordings. So it's based around live recordings. It's kind of like jam bands. Like you want to buy the show that you went to where it was your birthday and they gave you a shout out on your birthday and things like that. And that, I wouldn't say it's thriving, but right, it's still like really potent. And in some ways it's because it was never reliant on that kind of same sort of mid-level, I guess, local infrastructure that music in Detroit was, where you had like local labels, you had local radio stations, you had local radio DJs who would support the local scene. Go-go was always sort of despised by the powers that be, and so in some ways proved more resilient, I guess, with some of these transformations.
Right on. I think this might be a good time to open things up to questions. Are there any mics in the audience? Roving? Does anyone want a mic? Does anyone have any questions?
I will bring a mic.
All right.
Just want to say first, the panel is awesome, so thank you for doing this. A couple of things. A couple of things that I'm going to throw a lot out there, and if you want to answer or not, that's great. But a couple of things first. So one of the most interesting things I think you all talked about was fan labor, and on a very macro level. I come from punk, and so there was this genre of punk like 3 to 5 years ago, and it was a serious genre called Mysterious Guy Hardcore. And the idea of these bands was to not embrace the internet, just like totally blacklist the internet. Have records come out and work through channels of like labels, and work through channels of like people promoting their shows and like booking tours, but just blacklist the internet. The idea kind of came out though that like instead of the bands doing the PR work, which is punk bands tend to do that themselves, they would just let their fans do it. So you'd have these crazy fans like tweeting and like Facebooking about like, oh, I just bought the new Sex Vid record for like $200 on eBay. I'm like, that was an actual like thing, and that became like the labor itself. Like that was like, oh, Sex Vid has a new record out, like, and so people would just talk about that on message boards. Like it would be a thing for weeks, like just, oh, this band 7-inch is so great. I don't know who they are, there are no pictures of them, they just exist. And their shows would like sell out. And I think that was a really, at least for me, that was a really good kind of like, flag for like, wow, the band's not doing any work in that regard. It's just me. I'm just doing that work. The other thing I wanted to like touch upon was, what do you all think of like labels in terms of, I believe labels should exist. I run a label, it's, I love doing it, but I feel like labels have become more like Web 2.0 like PR firms, and like the actual physical record like doesn't really matter, and it doesn't even matter how it's released, it's just how much can we talk about this release and what does that really mean. So I'm kind of curious, like, do you all think that labels exist in that realm, and the record, the physical, even the music itself doesn't really matter? So I'm curious about that.
So thanks for those questions. They're really interesting. I wanted to talk a little bit more first about this fan labor idea. So there's actually researchers in musicology and law and computer science. They have this thing called the Cultural Capital Project, which if you Google it right now, you can find it. And I have some notes about how they describe themselves, because they're basically saying, well, we can't sell records anymore, so let's create a website where fans curate pages and we just pay artists based on fan interaction, right? And this is like like they're getting grants to fund this idea, and it's seen as like finally we can, compensate musicians for their labor based on, fan labor. right? So they say, music fans cultivate artist and personal pages, aggregating publicly available music videos and photos and other cultural data, and the service delivers equitable compensations to artists, right? So I think this is seen as some sort of like way to salvage the music industry, right? If we can only, instead of selling records, we'll just commodify or monetize fan labor. So I think that's definitely a thing. And I think labels are important because they do actual work, right? Like when you release an album, like I have a day job, so I don't have time to do all that PR, right? Because I'm doing PR for my real job, right? As an academic. So like labels are important for the kind of feminized work, right? Of like office labor, right? PR, promotion. I mean, this is the same with my books, right? Like I need someone to like send out press releases for reviews so that I don't have to do that because I'm busy writing other books. So I think labels are important precisely for their labor. Yeah.
Yeah, I think labels are also important sometimes as a culture, like I think
Yeah.
of like Lucky Me or We Did It or something, kind of just being affiliated with that squad kind of becomes part of the narrative of the artist. I think that I'm sure that's true on Mysterious Dude Hardcore as well. Yeah.
I would say, I think you talk about the labor that labels do. I don't think it's so much PR, but it is, it's marketing, it is distribution. It's all the boring shit that artists are never, ever going to want to do. They need people to do that, and unless you're a Macklemore, you can't really pay for people to do it just for you. They're going to do it for everyone else too. So labels are going to be around in that capacity, and also just providing financial resources. The idea that there is an industry out there, however diminished, that is geared towards the financing, creating music, is important. Somebody's got to pay for Kanye West to fly everyone to Hawaii so they can make my beautiful records to fantasy, and that's the label that does that. So I think in terms of financial resources and sort of the grunt work and distribution, there's a lot of tech that has to, there's a lot of technical processes to getting MP3s to Spotify and beats and now Tidal. There's a lot of infrastructure there. So I think those are the primary functions of labels that are going to keep them around for the foreseeable future.
We'll give another question in the back.
Thank you. Great. I wondered if there was a way you might address both the children's impact, by children I mean 13-year-olds and younger, on the industry, and the gendered aspect of that. So I'm thinking about YouTube, and I'm also thinking about this intersection with strip clubs. I knew work was working, but I was really fascinated by this long history of using the strip club to bring music to the fore, which clearly is a female constituents in strip clubs. So I wondered if you might, I'd love to hear from you about the gendered aspect of that relative to what goes on with women in those spaces, and where women's agency as producers, as creatives comes up, and then how children are under the affordances and the constraints.
That's a really good point. I've never really sort of considered that, right? But every time some YouTube video of a 13-year-old dancing, goes viral and popular, it's like a kind of child labor, right? In a way, right? So wow, I have to really kind of marinate on that one. As far as the strip clubs, absolutely. There's a sort of sexual, I would say, a sexual division of labor, right? Because the DJs were sort of overwhelmingly male, generally heterosexual, a little bit of not sort of cut and dry on that. But they also sort of, in a weird way, the strippers were sort of had a curatorial function, right? Where they would it would be the songs that they wanted to dance to, and so the DJs are trying to appeal, their initial audience in those spaces are the women, right? And if the woman likes it and the woman wants that to be her song and gets it played a lot, and then it sort of catches on, right? It's a really weird and sort of really understudied, and I haven't really studied it enough, sort of venue for music that I think is distinct and really important.
Can I intervene in that?
Sure.
Tease it a bit. So back in October 2011, when I can't remember the girl's name, she released a video. A video was released of an adolescent black girl giving head to her boyfriend she wanted to get back with her boyfriend, and he said, "You do this for me, and I'll get back with you." And for me, the strip club dancers is a bit of how they make their money is based on what's going on in the strip club for men. It's not like women run strip clubs. So if I've got to work, I definitely want to have fun. And for, at least in the black community, dance is everything. So I mean, yeah, I want to dance. There is I know a history of that same paradigm you're talking about with African master drummers in Ghana. That they want to play for me things that I like to dance to. So I know that that's, and I don't see that necessarily as good or bad. That's just the paradigm of the gender division. So. And your children.
You don't want to go there?
Hi guys, great panel. I have a question about sort of bands touring, and especially with the exposure of especially smaller bands to much broader audiences that are sort of around the world. Touring is quite a lot. It seems like kind of a fun thing for them. It exposes them to different sort of audiences. But I wonder about the ways in which this is sort of maybe possibly also detracting from more sort of the continuation of sort of more local music venues, and especially I'm especially interested in the ways in which this sort of kind of also is tied up with kind of the international sort of dominance of English as a language, and the ways in which sort of the certain bands will tour because they sort of sing in English at a much larger audience, and certain bands, Latin American pop bands sort of won't make it above Mexico City and that sort of thing. So it's just sort of a collection of thoughts. But I'm wondering if you guys have any responses to it.
I was actually kind of thinking about, obviously local music hasn't died, but if it's declined in some sense, or the spatiality is altered in a way, there's a sense that it becomes sort of linguistically based, right? Although I think that that's unstable as well. I mean, Gangnam Style, anybody? I don't even think that those are exceptions that prove the rule, right? I think it is a sort of different terrain, and I do think maybe people are more open than they have in the past to consuming sort of music from non-native cultures or people that speak a different language from them. I do it a lot, and I know other people do as well.
It makes me think also just how insanely successful EDM DJs are and how much money they make touring, and maybe how it's not just, maybe English is the favorable language, or maybe having no language at all is the best. And I think that, Gangnam Style, and I think of that Stromae song, Lower Dance, which is, those are songs that kind of popped off in an English-speaking world, but really you don't have to know what they're saying, and it's almost like the non-language bits are more important.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you, I've written about this. Cell phone bans at concerts. Why do people love cell phone bans? Everybody makes fun of people holding up their phones, taking pictures at concerts, and people really get into cell phone bans, but then they don't follow them. People still want to take the photos. Does documenting experience ruin experience? Is it less real to take photos? why don't I see them at punk shows, but if you go to a Katy Perry concert, that's totally cool to take as many photos as you want. What's going on with that? Does anybody have any
What is
thoughts
a
on
cell phone ban for this?
that? Oh, like a ban on taking pictures at the concert. So, like St. Vincent will say, you know, nobody take your phones out during the concert so we can have a more real and authentic experience in the moment instead of taking your selfies. It's a very uncharitable description. St. Vincent's position on it.
I don't know. I'm not so anti taking pictures at concerts. I mean, I think there's within reason. Like, I totally empathize, and I think everyone can understand, you know, wanting to capture the moment of seeing, you know, your favorite artist perform. I mean, there's something wonderful about live music that brought people there for a reason, right? And they're going to want to remember it. And we certainly live in a culture now that, you know, where social media is a part of how we conceive of ourselves and how we remember, you know, and tell people who we are. So, I mean, I think, you know, do you want somebody to be, you know, have the video out and they're recording an entire song? I think maybe that's, you know, not ideal. But I mean, personally, I don't have any problem with taking out a photo and snapping getting a quick pic and then being done with it. You know, it doesn't take long. It's like, you know, it's a second.
Yeah, I am really mystified by people who just tape the entire, like, just are sitting there making a bunch of videos. I'm like, are you vlogging on the side? And clearly, I mean, as somebody who, I'm very thankful sometimes for the people who do record Kanye's rants or whatever. But yeah, I always take photos at concerts and like really enjoy doing so. And I think that if, you know, that more often than not, they look a lot worse than you hope they will. It's very hard to get a good one. And I think that, you know, I think like a Miley Cyrus tour where she comes flying in on like a blunt or whatever is made for Instagram. But more often than not, like if you're just standing really far away from Tame Impala, like that's not going to be a dope Instagram. People don't like those, but yeah, I think at festivals it's definitely it's a little out of control how people have paid a lot of money to go hang out there, and it's a little wild. But I don't know that it means that the concert's less enjoyable. So I don't love the bands.
I wonder if the bans are about fan etiquette as a status marker among audiences, right? Like I think about like, if I'm gonna go see free jazz, I'm not gonna talk during the show, right? So like there's specific kinds of etiquette for specific kinds of audiences that are status and genre markers. And I wonder if that's not it's probably part of what's going on, it's probably not the whole thing, but I wonder if that's not a significant factor, right? Like the sort of sociological distinctions that fan etiquette conveys.
But I mean, I think that's a great point because I think the people who, like, I don't know, Jack White doesn't want your phone out. I actually don't know St. Vincent of New York doesn't want your phone out. I haven't been to a rap show where people have not encouraged me to put my phone up. So, I mean, it's kind of, yeah, like, I think there's absolutely a little, and maybe that's kind of I think selfie sticks in like a Coachella crowd are annoying, like logistically, but it doesn't rub me the wrong way, and it kind of rubs me the wrong way that anybody would think that their show is so great.
Right.
That somebody else can participate in it.
I mean, it's kind of a dick move. I mean, I don't mind just to tell your fans you can't enjoy it. This is how you're supposed to enjoy my music. I mean, it doesn't work. It's not practical.
I saw your hand
Short
first.
people, being short.
I saw your hand first. I think this will be our last one.
Thank you. Thinking about cameras got me thinking about this a little bit with a lot of the live streaming platforms that exist out there now. You've seen Meerkat and Periscope blow up recently, and these big festivals like Coachella being live streamed, and Ultra Music Festival being live streamed, and all that. How do you see sort of live streaming and especially democratized live streaming technology affecting the way that live music, the way that culture relates to live music, especially like buying a concert ticket sort of grants you access to this real-time intimate space of a performance that's sort of like gated off, and how live streaming technology might change that, and it might change the economics around it. Do you guys have any thoughts about that?
I think it's been really exciting to see huge festivals live streaming, kind of making artists super accountable for what happened. I remember like Outkast at Coachella was kind of that first week. It was kind of a disaster. Like the world was watching. It was exciting. exciting, and I think that it makes it such a bigger event than it would have been in the past. Yeah, but I also think I think that watching a concert on a live stream is if you really just want to see how well the performance is going and hear the songs, that's absolutely the best way to do it, and just don't go to the show. And that's kind of exciting, actually. If you're interested in, if I want to watch a bunch of Mexico City bands or something. But I think that that's a very different experience from being at a show and hanging out with your friends and kind of having to get in and going through the emotional roller coaster of taking your selfie after you get yelled at or whatever.
I mean, I've never actually seen a Meerkat or a Periscope. Every time I click, it's always gone. It's so fast. But I'm with Naomi. I love watching live streams. Fader 4 was live streamed in 4K or something crazy like that this year.
Shout out to Dell.
It's beautiful. Whenever Coachella does it, it's when done well professionally by whoever's putting on the concert. I think it's awesome. And I think if I ever do see a Periscope or a Meerkat, I'm not sure how the quality is, but I think as the technology gets better, then it'll just create more opportunities to have a good experience seeing a concert without actually being there.
As a follow-up, do you see that changing the economics of live shows at all? For instance, the NFL, they charge bars and establishments to stream the NFL games to people en masse. Could we see something like that happen with music, with these events? Or do you see these platforms, these live streaming platforms, sort of taking their cut of revenue?
I think it goes back to what Naomi was saying about the experience of being there with your friends. I think it's an interesting comparison to sports. I think, but perhaps even more so with music, because there's not that level of distance, right? You're not watching someone look like an ant on the field. You're in the crowd. You know what I mean? That's a very visceral experience. So I think in a certain way, the music and concerts are insulated from that sort of copying.
I guess I want to maybe be a little skeptical here and say the point of going to see a show is to go with people, right? Because nowadays most bands never play as well as they record, right? Especially the big EDM festivals, right? That is made to be consumed in earbuds, right? Not to be heard, right? And in fact, your experience at the festival is actually much crappier, right? But the point is to be there, right? So I'd even sort of compare this to purely online college versus going to college. No, right? Because the whole point of going to college is to meet people who can give you a job later, right?
And to do drugs.
Much like festivals.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so there's the actual sort of social experience that's still not at all democratizing, right? So I think there's still that, being there with people that has both aesthetic properties, but also status, right? And the live streaming, you can see the show, but you're not getting the other aspects, the non-musical aspects of the experience, I guess.
All right, well, apologies to the people on the live stream. That's why we're all here. We couldn't be doing this all digitally, but it's in person. We're doing this all day again tomorrow. At this time tomorrow, we're going to be hopping over the bridge to an after party with booze and pizza, stuff like that at the Verso Law. But right now, if you could all give a big round of applause
Thank you.
Thank you. That was good.
We did it.